Well, welcome to Thursday, February 29th. I don't get to say that very often.
Only every 4 years or thereabouts.
Thereabouts. Actually, 4 years exactly.
Well.
So it's leap year. This is leap day. So here we are, 229.
Do you know anybody who's born on a leap year?
I don't.
I do. I know a couple of people who are born on a leap year. They're
So-
really young.
Yeah.
Only have a birthday every so often.
You're so funny. So we're talking about Jesus being in Jerusalem. We talked a little bit yesterday about him being in this town of Bethphage. Often, we translate that into English as Bethpage. I think we end up with a lot of Bethpages, a lot of Bethpage churches.
Mm-hmm.
But however you want to pronounce it, that's not really the point. The point is he is going to be entering into Jerusalem, and this is what we call the triumphal entry. That's how it's labeled in most Bibles. And the people come in, so Jesus is coming into town, and there's a bit of a show about it.
So many of the other Gospels add details that Mark doesn't about palm branches being waved, but we have to wrestle, I guess, with the reality of what size crowd would this have been. If the Roman authorities had been present and much of a crowd had gathered at all, they'd have broken that up. It is certainly somewhat sizable, however, and garners some attention that here's this man who obviously people had been hearing about, and yet he rides in, fascinatingly enough, not on this steed, not on this mare, not on this white horse with bravado. He intentionally rides in on a donkey.
Well, funny you should say that, because Mark says he rides in on a colt.
Colt, yeah, a young.
So there is a bit of a variance in the gospel accounts here. Some have Mark has a colt. Matthew has a colt and a donkey. Mm-hmm. Somehow he rides in on both. Don't get caught up in those semantics. You get back to the point you're trying to make, that Jesus comes in a humble manner, not in a domineering, conquering form. And this would have been this is intentional, because Jesus is doing the opposite of what would have taken place probably just a few days before he shows up, and that would have been Pilate. Pilate didn't spend all of his time in Jerusalem. Pilate was the regional governor, the head of the Roman. He represented Rome back to that region, so he's a big deal. And Pilate would have brought, again, Pilate doesn't live in Jerusalem because Pilate doesn't want to live in Jerusalem, because he would have considered it to be a backwater, dirty kind of place. Pilate has his headquarters almost certainly out at Caesarea by the sea, mm-hmm. and which would have been on the Mediterranean. It's a Roman town built by Romans. It would have had all the things that would have reminded him of home, whereas Jerusalem, of course, is a Jewish community, Jewish town. So at Passover, and I think it's worth spending a little time on thinking about the dynamics. Jerusalem, and I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but Jerusalem wasn't that big of a city. So we're talking 50, 60,000 people, maybe 70,000 people. Decent size, but not huge. But when Passover comes, the population swells to upwards of 250,000 as people flock into the community to come to the temple to celebrate Passover at their holy site. So Pilate would have brought the garrison of the Roman legion in from Caesarea, and with a show of force. Mm. And when they came into town, you better believe that he wanted everybody to know they were there. They would have come in with their swords, their spears, their shields, their chariots, their horses, and it would have been a way of saying, this is the power of Rome. Because at the heart of Passover, it's a celebration of a revolt against an empire. Mm-hmm. The revolt of the Jews against the Egyptians, and the overthrow of the then king of the world, which was Pharaoh. So it's a way of saying, don't get any ideas. So when Jesus comes in, it's almost makes a mockery of what Pilate would have done.
And they cry out this fascinating word, Hosanna, which kind of loosely translated means God save us, which we're really not sure exactly what they had in mind when they shouted this word Hosanna. For us, it's irony that he does come to save them, but probably not in the way they anticipated.
Well, it's also an interesting take on a tradition of the time that whenever a dignitary would visit a town, you didn't wait for the dignitary to get into town. You would go out and met them and ushered them in. So it's a way of saying, we recognize something about you, and we're going to make a way for you to come in.
And those echoes of, again, the messianic expectation in chapter 11, verse 10, blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. They still have this expectation about the Messiah. But interestingly, Steve, Jesus walks into Jerusalem and he goes straight to the temple. We don't know the last time Jesus has been to the temple, but we know he was there probably at age 12 from the Gospel of Luke. Not sure, has he been there between then and now?
If you in the Synoptic Gospels, the answer, it's not recorded.
Right.
John's Gospel has Jesus in Jerusalem several times, but it's very possible that Jesus had not been in Jerusalem since he was a child. Yeah. And for us that seems almost unfathomable, but yet it's first century. He spent most of his life up and around Nazareth. His ministry is almost exclusively at least in the Synoptics again, in that region of Galilee, headquartered in Capernaum. So this coming into Jerusalem was a big deal. And so of course he would, like any good Jew, he would want to go see the temple. Yeah. And the temple was something to see. You have to remember this is
Herod's temple that had been restored and beautified.
Right. So you had Solomon's temple, which was one of the wonders of the ancient world, that which was destroyed by the Babylonians or the Assyrians and all of those kind of things. It was rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah, but it was kind of shabby. But then Herod, and why he was called Herod the Great wasn't because he was a good dude. Yeah. Because he built great big things.
Right.
And he undertook a building process that took, 40-some years? Mm-hmm. And it was a huge temple complex. It was grand, and Herod wanted it as a showpiece for his own personal power to show the Romans, hey, I can indeed govern on your behalf. I know what I'm doing. And I want people to recognize that I'm somebody of importance. So Jesus goes in. That sets a little bit of the political understanding of the temple. And so he goes in, and it's fascinating. He goes and just looks around. Doesn't really say what he did. When he looked around at everything as it was already late, he went back out to Bethany. So again, it's not a long trip. So that's where you're staying. He's heading back out to where he's being housed.
Yeah, it is fascinating to think about his relationship to the temple. We will hear in just another couple of chapters, chapter 13, about the destruction of that temple and the promise that destroy the temple in me and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. All of that is interesting connections between Jesus is the living temple. He is the living presence of God, whereas the temple always represented for the people. That's where God lived. But Jesus is saying, no.
Right, it's that place where heaven and earth overlap in their imagination and in their practice.
So we'll finish out today this beautiful, fascinating passage about Jesus cursing a fig tree on the following day. They came from Bethany. He was hungry. He sees a fig tree, but the fig tree has nothing on it. What you got to recognize here is that the fig tree was and always has been kind of a metaphor for the people called Israel. It was their relationship to God. It was this fig tree. Jesus sees that it has no figs on it. It is not producing the fruit that it was intended. And
what's interesting, though, is that Mark goes to the trouble of saying it was not the season for figs. Yeah. So why are you expecting?
Right. Yeah. Even though it wasn't fig producing time, Jesus still cursed it because it wasn't. But again, it's a metaphor about what God had expected from God's people. And they were not living up. The fruit they were producing was certainly not righteousness, not living in the right relationship with God. So that tree is that image.
Yep.
So we'll stop there today. We'll look forward to being back with you tomorrow as Jesus comes back and cleanses that temple. We'll talk about that tomorrow.